If you want to make a video game, you're gonna need a plan.
Do I really look like a guy with a plan?
But where'd you begin? And how'd you know when you finished? And what'd you do in between? In this episode, we're going to be talking about the stages of video game development. Welcome back to the Crunch Button. Yeah, welcome back to the Crunch Button, where we pull back the digital curtain and talk about how video games are made in professional development studios. My name's Nathan Baseley, and I've been a producer and a game director for over 17 years, and I'm going to be your host today as we talk about the stages of video game development projects. Okay, let's get started. So we need a beginning and an end. Well, in episode 1 we talked about the pitching process. The beginning of our project timeline is the point at which a pitch is approved. The end of our timeline is going to be the point at which the game that we make is in retail stores and goes into retail. We'll call that release. In the middle of our project, we're going to have 3 big stages, the first of which is called pre-production. That's the stage before production where we get everything ready and we answer key questions. More on that in a moment. Production is our big phase in the middle where the game is made. And the last of the 3 big phases is pre-release. That's the point after which the game is finished, but we are fixing bugs and we are preparing to release the game. Now, as we've talked about before, the concepts in this podcast are generalized and fundamental and should apply to most game development situations, but there will always be cases where they don't. Now, one thing that does change between studios and projects is the proportion that these 3 stages represent per project. The release phase changes least from project to project because that's the amount of time that QA need and the retailers need and the publishing team needs to get the game into retail. In shorter development cycles, pre-production is often compressed, and on very long timelines, the production phase can be a much more significant part of the timeline. It's not always the case that everything has to have a pre-production phase before any production can start, and similarly that all of production has to be finished before pre-release can start. For example, I've seen these stages staggered by game feature or game area on much more complex projects. Let's talk about pre-production. The purpose of pre-production is to reduce your risks and answer your key questions before you really start spending money. Pre-production typically ends with a playable demo that we call a vertical slice or a first publishable. The aim of the demo is to represent all of the core elements of the game. So for example, if you have weapons in the game, your vertical slice will typically include 1 or 2 of them, enough to demonstrate that the weapon works and that you can switch between them. However, if your weapons fall into several categories, then you would want 1 of each. If character customization is a core part of the experience, you will try to represent each thing that can be customized, but not the full scope. So you might, for example, have 1 male and 1 female character for vertical slice to demonstrate that you can switch between the 2. Vertical slice will be a snapshot of 1 level. If you've got driving, shooting, climbing in your game, you will want all 3 of those things represented in a small way. Pre-production will ask the question, who do you need to make the game? And have you got them? It's unlikely that you'll leave pre-production until you've got your core team in place. Going back to the beginning of pre-production, it starts with talking to the team about what you're making. What does the pitch document say? You start to prototype, and those prototypes start to inform the game design. And by the end of pre-production, you have a game design document or a GDD. That document is a statement of what it is that you're going to be making. So pre-production ends with a demo of the game, the defined scope, and the resources and people in place to make it. Pre-production also tends to include some user testing and maybe some focus testing to test your assumptions about the audience and the game that you want to make. Many games get cancelled or significantly changed in pre-production. But the important thing to remember is that is the time to do it. If the game concept is not right, now is the time to cancel or change it. Production is probably what you have in your mind when you think about game development. It's the process of making all of the assets, making all of the levels, making all of the characters, doing all of the UI, composing all of the music, implementing all of those things together. Testing the game, playing the game, doing user testing, recording your dialogue, performance capture. Now you'll want a plan that breaks your production phase down into milestones. And often those milestones will be based upon progress through your scope. For example, by this point you'll have 50% of your levels. By this point you'll have all of your weapons done. Production also includes a lot of tweaking and balancing and testing. Production will also be the phase during which you tend to announce your game. Also, QA begins during production. In some teams you might have them in pre-production, you always have them in production. QA are there testing the work as it's implemented into the builds. At the end of production we have our pre-release window. As you get a few months away from your release, so the pre-release window begins. And it tends to begin with an alpha submission for format QA. Alpha is about functionality. Does your game work in the way that you expect it to work? Is the functionality in place? Is it stable? And most of the content is expected by this point. Beta is about content complete. Are all of the assets in place? If you have 50 characters, are they all there? And then before your final submission, getting the bug numbers down as low as possible, fixing all of the most serious issues, and trying not to introduce any new problems. Then the build goes off to format QA and you await approval. If you don't get approval, you fix the issues and you submit again. Now that's the end of a traditional game development project. So that takes us up to release. However, we now have a live game window, the length of which varies depending on the type of game you've made and how long you intend to support it. You may, for example, plan to fix any issues that come up in the first month and address them with a patch. You may have a DLC release window, or be supporting the game with community challenges and season packs and that sort of thing. So there we go. So those are our high-level project stages for developing games in professional studios. If you have any questions, pop them in the comments. And thanks for watching another episode of The Crunch Button.